The morning fog rolled across the naval training facility like a gray blanket, muffling the sound of boots hitting concrete. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her government-issued sedan, her crisp Navy uniform perfectly pressed despite the early hour. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every stripe on her sleeve through blood, sweat, and determination that most people couldn't imagine. The Coronado Naval Special Warfare Center buzzed with activity even at 0500 hours. Sarah had been here countless times before, but never in this capacity. Today marked her first day as the new hand-to-hand combat instructor for SEAL Team candidates. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was walking into what many considered the most elite boys' club in the military. She made her way through the maze of buildings, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The walls were lined with photographs of previous SEAL classes, their faces weathered and determined. Sarah had trained many of these men during her previous assignments, though they probably never realized it at the time. Her reputation in special operations circles was well established, but, here at Coronado, she was starting fresh. The training facility's main gymnasium stretched before her like an aircraft hangar. Mats covered the floor in precise rows, and the smell of sweat and determination hung in the air from decades of brutal training sessions. Sarah set down her gear bag and began her morning inspection routine. Every piece of equipment needed to be perfect. Lives depended on the training that would happen in this room. "You must be the new instructor." The voice came from behind her, carrying a tone that made her skin crawl. Sarah turned to see Chief Petty Officer Brad Hawkins approaching with 3 other instructors in tow. Hawkins had the build of a man who spent more time in the gym than in actual combat, his muscles bulging beneath his tight-fitting shirt. His companions wore matching smirks that suggested they had been planning this encounter. "Lieutenant Mitchell," she replied, extending her hand professionally. Hawkins looked at it for a moment before reluctantly shaking it, his grip unnecessarily firm. "So they're really going through with this diversity experiment," said Petty Officer First Class Danny Rodriguez, one of Hawkins' cronies. "What's next, sending kindergarten teachers to train SEALs?" Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her jaw tightened slightly. She had faced this attitude before, but it never got easier. "I'm here to do my job, just like everyone else." "Your job?" Hawkins laughed, and the others joined in. "Lady, do you have any idea what we do here? We break boys down and build them into weapons. We're not running some fitness class for soccer moms." The fourth man, Senior Chief Marcus Williams, stepped forward. Williams had the lean, dangerous look of someone who had seen real combat. Unlike the others, he wasn't smiling. "I've read your file, Lieutenant. Impressive on paper. But paper and reality are two different things." Sarah nodded slowly. She had expected this reception. In her 12 years of military service, she had faced skepticism, harassment, and outright hostility. But she had also proven herself time and again in ways these men couldn't imagine. "I understand your concerns," she said carefully. "Perhaps we could discuss my training methods and experience?" "Training methods?" Rodriguez snorted. "What are you going to teach them, yoga?" The laughter that followed was harsh and dismissive. Sarah felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same determination that had carried her through Ranger School, through multiple deployments, through countless situations where she had to prove herself. "Actually," Hawkins said, his voice taking on a particularly nasty edge, "why don't you show us what you've got? Right here, right now." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah looked around at the 4 men surrounding her, noting their positions, their body language, their obvious confidence. They thought they had cornered a rookie, someone they could intimidate into backing down or transferring out. "You want a demonstration?" she asked quietly. "Unless you're not up for it," Williams said. "Maybe you could call in sick, save everyone the embarrassment." Sarah set down her clipboard and began removing her dress uniform jacket. Underneath, she wore the standard Navy physical training shirt. The men exchanged glances, clearly not expecting her to accept their challenge. "Any particular rules?" she asked, rolling up her sleeves. "Just try not to get hurt too bad," Hawkins said, cracking his knuckles. "We'll go easy on you." What happened next would become legend among the SEAL training community, though it would take years for the full story to come out. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another Navy officer assigned to teach basic combat techniques. She was something these men had never encountered before, and they were about to learn that the hard way. The first thing they noticed was how she moved. As Hawkins approached, confident in his size advantage, Sarah shifted into a stance that seemed casual but was perfectly balanced. When he reached for her, thinking to demonstrate his superiority with a simple grappling move, she was no longer where he expected her to be. Hawkins found himself on the mat so fast he wasn't sure what had happened. One moment he was reaching for the small woman in front of him, the next he was staring at the ceiling with his arm twisted at an angle that sent shooting pains up to his shoulder. What the hell? Rodriguez started forward, but Williams held up a hand. Sarah helped Hawkins to his feet, her expression unchanged. Are you injured, Chief? Hawkins rubbed his shoulder, his face red with embarrassment and anger. Lucky shot. Would you like to try again? She offered politely. This time, Hawkins approached more carefully. He had 20 pounds and 6 inches on her, plus years of training in military combatives. But, as he engaged, he quickly realized he was dealing with something beyond his experience. Sarah's movements were economical and precise. She didn't rely on strength or size. Instead, she used leverage, timing, and techniques that seemed to flow from one to another like water. Within minutes, Hawkins was on the mat again, this time with Rodriguez beside him after attempting to help his friend. Williams watched with growing interest rather than amusement. Where did you train? He asked. Various places, Sarah replied, helping both men to their feet. Would you like to try? Williams was smarter than his companions. He had seen enough real combat to recognize skill when he saw it. But his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his team. He approached Sarah with the careful respect he would show a dangerous opponent. The match that followed was different from the others. Williams was skilled, experienced, and cautious. But Sarah was operating on a completely different level. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to fight not in gymnasiums but in places where mistakes meant death. When Williams finally found himself controlled on the mat, unable to move despite his best efforts, he looked up at Sarah with a new expression. Who are you? Sarah released him and stepped back. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, your new hand-to-hand combat instructor. But Williams shook his head. No, I mean, who are you really? That wasn't standard military combatives. That was something else entirely. Before Sarah could answer, the gymnasium doors burst open and a group of SEAL candidates jogged in for their morning training session. The young men, still in the early stages of their brutal selection process, stopped short when they saw 4 instructors on the mats with a woman standing over them. What's going on here? Asked one of the candidates, a tall kid from Texas named Jimmy Patterson. Hawkins scrambled to his feet, his face burning with humiliation. Nothing that concerns you, candidate. But the damage was done. Word would spread through the training facility like wildfire. The new instructor, the woman they had all been skeptical about, had just taken down 4 experienced combat instructors without breaking a sweat. As the candidates began their warm-up routines, Sarah gathered her gear and prepared for her first official class. She could feel the eyes of every man in the room on her, but the nature of their attention had changed. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by curiosity and, in some cases, respect. Williams approached her as she was setting up for the day's lesson. I need to know, he said quietly. Where did you really learn to fight like that? Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing her words. Chief, my job is to prepare these men for combat. Everything else is classified. But Williams wasn't satisfied. I've been in this business for 15 years. I've trained with Delta Force, Marine Recon, even some foreign special operations units. What you just did, that wasn't military standard. Sarah began arranging training equipment, her movements efficient and purposeful. Sometimes the best training happens in places that don't officially exist. The implication hung in the air between them. Williams studied her face, noting details he had missed before. The way she carried herself. The calluses on her hands. The small scars that spoke of violence encountered and survived. "You're spook," he said finally, using the military slang for intelligence operatives. Sarah's smile was neither confirmation nor denial. "I'm whatever the Navy needs me to be, Chief. Today, I'm your colleague." As the morning progressed, Sarah's first class began. The SEAL candidates approached the combat training session with the usual mixture of cockiness and anxiety that characterized men pushing themselves beyond normal human limits. They had heard about the incident with the instructors, but most chalked it up to exaggerated rumors. "Today we're going to work on close-quarters combat scenarios," Sarah announced, her voice carrying easily across the training area. "Specifically, situations where you might be outnumbered and fighting for your life." One of the candidates, a muscular former college football player named Mike Stevens, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, shouldn't we be learning this from someone with actual combat experience?" The question was asked politely, but the underlying skepticism was clear. Sarah nodded as if she had expected it. "That's a fair question, Stevens. What makes you think I don't have combat experience?" Stevens looked around at his fellow candidates, seeking support. "Well, ma'am, I just meant that, women aren't typically in direct combat roles." "Officially, you're correct," Sarah said. "But warfare doesn't always follow official guidelines. Sometimes you find yourself in situations that require adaptation." She gestured for Stevens to approach. "Why don't you show the class what you've learned so far about hand-to-hand combat?" Stevens was built like the linebacker he had been, with thick arms and a low center of gravity. He had wrestled in high school and had been through basic military combatives training. As he squared off against Sarah, he was careful to moderate his strength, not wanting to hurt his instructor. That consideration lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sarah moved with the same flowing precision she had demonstrated earlier, but this time the candidates could see the technical details. She didn't fight against Stevens' strength, she redirected it. She didn't try to overpower him, she used his own momentum against him. When Stevens found himself on the mat with Sarah's knee pressed against his throat and his arm controlled in a submission hold, the gymnasium fell completely silent. "Combat isn't about fair fighting," Sarah said, helping Stevens to his feet. "It's about survival. Sometimes that means using techniques that weren't in your manual." Patterson, the kid from Texas, stepped forward. "Ma'am, where did you learn to do that?" Sarah looked around at the group of young faces, seeing in them the same hunger for knowledge and improvement that had driven her own career. These men were volunteering for some of the most dangerous missions their country could offer. They deserved the best training she could give them. "I've had some unique opportunities to study combat techniques from various sources," she said carefully. "What matters is that you learn to adapt, to think beyond conventional approaches." Over the following hours, Sarah put the candidates through a series of exercises that challenged everything they thought they knew about fighting. She taught them techniques that blended multiple martial arts disciplines, showed them how to use improvised weapons, and demonstrated defensive moves that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile territory. But, more importantly, she began to change how they thought about combat itself. These weren't gym exercises or sporting competitions. This was preparation for real warfare, where the enemy wouldn't follow rules and where survival often depended on split-second decisions and unconventional thinking. By the end of the training session, word had spread throughout the facility. The new instructor wasn't just competent, she was operating at a level that few of them had ever seen. Phone calls were made to contacts at various commands, trying to piece together Sarah Mitchell's real background. As Sarah packed up her gear that afternoon, Williams approached her again. "I made some calls," he said without preamble. "Tried to find out more about your background." "And?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she knew what he had discovered. "Classified. Everything about your assignments for the past 8 years is classified above my clearance level." Williams paused. "That doesn't happen for regular Navy officers." Sarah shouldered her gear bag and started toward the exit. "Chief, those men in there are going to face situations that most people can't imagine. My job is to give them every possible advantage." Where I learned these techniques is less important than whether they're effective. But, it matters to the instructors, Williams said, falling into step beside her. We need to know if we can trust you, if you understand what we're trying to accomplish here. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face him. For the first time that day, her professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something harder underneath. Chief, I've spent the last 8 years in places that don't show up on maps, doing things that never make it into official reports. I've trained with people whose names you'll never know, learned techniques that most militaries have never heard of. I've killed men with my bare hands and walked out of situations that should have been impossible to survive. Williams felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't the polite Navy officer who had introduced herself that morning. This was someone else entirely. Every technique I taught today, every move I demonstrated, I learned because my life depended on it. So when you ask if I understand what you're trying to accomplish here, the answer is yes. I understand it better than you think. Sarah resumed walking, leaving Williams standing in the corridor. As she disappeared around a corner, he realized that the Navy had sent them something unprecedented, an instructor who might actually be more dangerous than the operators they were trying to create. That evening, as Sarah sat in her temporary quarters reviewing training plans for the following day, she allowed herself a small smile. The day had gone better than expected. The initial confrontation with the instructors had established her credibility, and the candidates had shown genuine eagerness to learn. But she also knew that today was just the beginning. Word of her abilities would spread, bringing attention she didn't want and questions she couldn't answer. Her real background would remain classified, but rumors would fill the gaps, and not all of those rumors would be helpful. Sarah looked at the photographs on her desk, fellow operators who had died in missions that officially never happened, friends whose sacrifice would never be publicly acknowledged. She had accepted this assignment partly to honor their memory, to pass on the hard-won knowledge that had cost so much to acquire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new skeptics, and new opportunities to prepare America's elite warriors for the realities they would face. Sarah Mitchell, the woman they had underestimated as a rookie instructor, was just getting started. The second week at Coronado brought new complications. Word of Sarah's demonstration had reached the base commander's office, generating both interest and concern from the higher-ups. Captain Robert Harrison, a career officer with 30 years of naval service, requested a private meeting with his newest instructor. Sarah knocked on the captain's office door precisely at 1,400 hours, her uniform immaculate and her bearing professional. Captain Harrison was a heavy-set man with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades managing the personalities and egos that populated special operations communities. "Sit down, Lieutenant," he said without looking up from a thick file on his desk. Sarah recognized her personnel jacket, though it appeared much thicker than it should have been for a standard Navy officer. "I've been getting some interesting reports about your teaching methods," Harrison continued, finally meeting her eyes. "Some of my instructors are concerned that you might be overcomplicating things." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Sir, could you be more specific about their concerns?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Chief Hawkins filed a complaint suggesting that your techniques are outside standard military doctrine. He's recommending a review of your curriculum before you continue training our candidates." "And what's your assessment, sir?" Sarah asked. "My assessment is that Hawkins is embarrassed and looking for a way to save face." Harrison opened her file and pulled out several documents. "But I also have some questions about your background that go beyond hurt feelings." The captain spread out copies of training reports, evaluation forms, and what appeared to be heavily redacted mission summaries. Even with most details blacked out, Sarah could see that someone had been digging into her classified assignments. "Lieutenant Mitchell, according to your official record, you've been a training instructor at various facilities for the past 8 years. But these documents tell a different story." Harrison pointed to one of the redacted reports. "This suggests you were deployed to Syria in 2019, officially as a liaison officer but with mission parameters that are classified beyond my clearance level." Sarah remained silent, knowing that anything she said could create problems down the line. "Here's another interesting entry," Harrison continued. 6 months in Afghanistan, working with a joint task force on counter-terrorism operations. Again, your specific role is classified, but the mission reports mention a female operative with advanced combat training. The captain set down the papers and looked directly at Sarah. I'm not trying to compromise your operational security, Lieutenant. But I need to know if my SEAL candidates are being trained by someone with real-world experience or if you're an experiment that could get my men killed. Sarah considered her response carefully. Sir, I can't discuss classified operations. But I can tell you that every technique I teach has been tested in real-world situations. These men will face enemies who won't follow conventional warfare rules. My job is to prepare them for that reality. That's what worries me, Harrison said. The SEALs have their own training protocols, developed over decades of successful operations. If you start teaching them unauthorized techniques, you could undermine their unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness. Before Sarah could respond, the office phone rang. Harrison answered it with visible irritation, but his expression changed quickly as he listened to the caller. Yes, sir. I understand. She's here now. Yes, sir, I'll make sure she gets the message. Harrison hung up and looked at Sarah with new concern. That was Admiral Peterson from Naval Special Warfare Command. It seems your reputation has reached some very high levels. The Admiral wants to see you in San Diego tomorrow morning. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her stomach. High-level attention usually meant either new opportunities or significant problems. In her experience, it was more often the latter. Did the Admiral indicate what this was regarding, sir? No, but he did mention that some people in Washington have been asking questions about your assignment here. Harrison closed her file and leaned forward. Lieutenant, I don't know what you were doing before you came here, but it's clear you weren't just teaching basic combatives at some training facility. Whatever your real background is, it's attracted attention from people who can make or break careers. That evening, Sarah drove down the coast toward San Diego, her mind racing through possible scenarios. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly to her left, its surface reflecting the dying light of sunset. She had always found the ocean calming, a reminder of forces larger than human ambition and politics. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unlisted number, "Be careful tomorrow. Friends are watching." Sarah deleted the message immediately, but its implications lingered. Her former colleagues in the intelligence community were keeping tabs on her situation, which could be either protective or threatening depending on the circumstances. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters 45 minutes early. The building was an imposing structure of concrete and glass, designed to project the power and efficiency of America's most elite military units. She used the extra time to review everything she knew about Admiral Peterson and the politics surrounding SEAL training programs. Admiral Peterson's office was on the top floor, with windows overlooking the naval facilities and the bay beyond. When Sarah was finally escorted inside, she found herself facing a man who radiated the quiet authority that came from decades of leading dangerous men on impossible missions. Lieutenant Mitchell, Peterson said, gesturing for her to sit. Thank you for coming on short notice. Peterson was younger than Captain Harrison, probably in his early 50s, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone who stayed in fighting shape. Sarah had researched his background during the drive down and knew he was a former SEAL Team 6 commander with multiple combat deployments. I've been hearing interesting things about your work at Coronado, the Admiral continued. Some of my people are very impressed with your skills, while others have concerns about your methods. Sir, I'm committed to providing the best possible training for SEAL candidates, Sarah replied. If there are specific concerns about my methods, I'm happy to address them. Peterson smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. The concerns aren't about your competence, Lieutenant. They're about your background and what you might really be doing at my training facility. The Admiral opened a file that was even thicker than the one Captain Harrison had shown her. This one contained photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold, surveillance images of her in various foreign locations, mission reports that should have been destroyed years ago, and personnel evaluations from commanders whose names she recognized from highly classified operations. According to this file, you don't exist, Peterson said calmly. Officially, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell has been a training instructor for 8 years. Unofficially, you've been one of the most effective deep cover operatives in the intelligence community. Sarah kept her expression carefully neutral, but her mind was racing. If the Admiral had access to this level of detail about her background, it meant someone very high up had authorized its release. That could be good or very bad, depending on the agenda behind it. The woman sitting in front of me has killed at least 15 enemy operatives in face-to-face combat, Peterson continued, reading from one of the reports. She's infiltrated terrorist organizations in 3 different countries, spent 2 years embedded with Russian special forces as part of a long-term intelligence operation, and has personally trained counter-terrorism units in techniques that officially don't exist. The Admiral set down the file and studied Sarah's face. So my question is simple: what is someone with your background really doing teaching hand-to-hand combat to SEAL candidates? Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. Her cover was blown, at least partially, and any response she gave would have consequences that extended far beyond this office. She decided on a carefully measured version of the truth. Sir, I requested this assignment because I believe our special operations forces need better preparation for the threats they're facing. My previous experiences taught me techniques and approaches that could save American lives. Your previous experiences, Peterson repeated. Is that what we're calling 8 years of black operations now? Before Sarah could answer, the office door opened and a man in civilian clothes entered without knocking. Sarah recognized the type immediately: intelligence community, probably CIA, with the cold eyes and careful movements of someone accustomed to violence. Admiral, the newcomer said, I'm afraid this briefing needs to be classified above Lieutenant Mitchell's current clearance level. Peterson looked annoyed. Agent Morrison, this is my command. I'll decide what clearance levels are required. Morrison smiled, but it was the predatory expression of someone holding all the cards. Sir, with respect, this matter involves ongoing national security operations. The lieutenant's presence here is no accident, and her real mission parameters are classified at the highest levels. Sarah felt the walls closing in. She had hoped to complete her assignment at Coronado without drawing this level of attention, but clearly that was no longer possible. The question now was whether she would be pulled back into the intelligence world or allowed to continue her training mission. What exactly are you saying? Peterson demanded. Morrison produced a document from his briefcase and handed it to the Admiral. Lieutenant Mitchell is here under deep cover, running a recruitment and evaluation operation. Some of your SEAL candidates have been flagged for possible recruitment into specialized units that don't officially exist. The pieces clicked into place for Sarah. She wasn't just teaching combat techniques, she was identifying candidates suitable for the same kind of classified operations she had been running. The intelligence community was using her SEAL training assignment to scout for potential deep cover operatives. Peterson read the document, his expression growing darker with each line. You're telling me that my training facility is being used as a recruitment center for spook operations? Among other things, Morrison confirmed. The lieutenant's combat demonstrations weren't just about establishing credibility. They were designed to identify candidates who could think outside conventional military doctrine. Sarah realized that every training session, every interaction with the candidates, had been observed and analyzed. Her former colleagues had been watching not just her performance but the responses of the men she was training. This is unacceptable, Peterson said, his voice tight with controlled anger. My SEALs aren't resources for your intelligence operations. Morrison's smile became even more predatory. Sir, with respect, that decision is made at levels well above your authority. The global threat environment requires new approaches, and traditional military training isn't sufficient for some of the challenges we're facing. The Admiral turned to Sarah, his eyes hard. Is this true? Are you evaluating my candidates for recruitment? Sarah met his gaze directly. Sir, my primary mission is exactly what I said, providing the best possible combat training for SEAL candidates. Any other considerations are secondary to that objective. It wasn't exactly a denial, but it wasn't a confirmation either. Sarah hoped Peterson would understand the constraints she was operating under. Morrison stood up, clearly preparing to leave. "Admiral, Lieutenant Mitchell will continue her training duties. However, her evaluation reports will be shared with appropriate intelligence agencies for national security purposes." "Like hell they will," Peterson shot back. "Those men volunteered to serve their country as Navy SEALs, not as intelligence operatives. Sometimes service to country requires flexibility in assignments," Morrison replied smoothly. "The lieutenant has proven that unconventional backgrounds can produce exceptional results." After Morrison left, the office fell silent. Admiral Peterson stared out the window at the naval facilities below, his jaw tight with frustration. Sarah waited, knowing that her future at Coronado might depend on his next words. "Lieutenant," he said finally, "I want you to understand something. I don't care what kind of games the intelligence community is playing. My job is to train SEALs who can protect American interests around the world. If your methods help accomplish that mission, I'll support you. But, if I find out you're compromising my people for some intelligence agenda, I'll have you transferred so fast it'll make your head spin." "Understood, sir," Sarah replied. "My commitment is to those candidates and their preparation for real-world operations." Peterson turned back to face her. "Good. Now, I want you to tell me about these techniques you've been teaching. Not the classified operational details, but the practical applications. How do they make my SEALs more effective?" For the next 2 hours, Sarah provided a detailed briefing on her training methods, explaining how each technique addressed specific threats that conventional military training didn't adequately cover. She discussed urban warfare scenarios, improvised weapon usage, and psychological warfare techniques that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. By the time the briefing concluded, Admiral Peterson's attitude had shifted from suspicion to grudging respect. Whatever Sarah's real agenda might be, her knowledge was undeniably valuable for preparing SEALs for modern warfare. "One more thing," Peterson said as Sarah prepared to leave. "I want regular reports on your training progress, and I want to be notified immediately if anyone from the intelligence community tries to recruit my candidates without going through proper channels." Sarah nodded, understanding that she now had a powerful ally but also increased scrutiny. Her mission at Coronado had become significantly more complicated, but it was still achievable. As she drove back toward the base that evening, Sarah reflected on the day's developments. Her cover was blown, her real mission was partially exposed, and she was now caught between military and intelligence community interests. But the SEAL candidates were still her primary responsibility, and she was determined to give them every advantage she could provide. The next morning back at Coronado, Sarah noticed immediate changes in how she was treated. Several instructors who had previously been hostile now watched her with wary respect, clearly having received word about her background. The candidates seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, approaching their training with increased intensity. During the morning combat session, Sarah decided to address the elephant in the room directly. After putting the candidates through a particularly challenging series of exercises, she called them together for a debrief. "Some of you may have heard rumors about my background," she began, looking around at the circle of sweating, exhausted faces. "What matters isn't where I learned these techniques, but whether they'll help keep you alive when you're operating in hostile territory." Candidate Patterson raised his hand. "Ma'am, are the stories true? About you being some kind of secret agent?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Patterson, the only thing that's secret about me is that I'm going to make this training harder than you think you can handle. The question is whether you're tough enough to learn from it." The candidates exchanged glances, clearly realizing that whatever Sarah's background might be, it had given her knowledge that could be invaluable to their future missions. Over the following days, they threw themselves into the training with renewed dedication, eager to learn everything she could teach them. But Sarah knew that the political complications were just beginning. Her presence at Coronado had attracted attention from multiple agencies, each with their own agenda for America's most elite warriors. The real challenge wouldn't be teaching combat techniques, it would be protecting her candidates from becoming pawns in games they didn't even know were being played. 3 weeks into her assignment, Sarah's training program had become the talk of the entire naval special warfare community. Her methods were being discussed in Pentagon briefings, analyzed by training specialists, and quietly studied by special operations units from other branches of the military. But success brought its own problems. The morning started like any other, with Sarah arriving at the training facility before dawn to prepare for the day's exercises. However, she found the gymnasium already occupied by a group of men she didn't recognize. They were dressed in civilian clothes but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of military personnel. "Lieutenant Mitchell?" One of them approached her, a tall man with prematurely gray hair and the build of someone who had spent years in special operations. "I'm Colonel James Parker, Army Special Operations Command." "We need to talk." Sarah set down her gear bag, instantly alert. The presence of Army Special Operations personnel at a Navy facility could mean several things, none of them particularly good for her current mission. "What can I do for you, Colonel?" Parker gestured to his companions. "These are representatives from various special operations units. We've been hearing about your training methods, and, frankly, we're concerned about the precedent being set here." The other men stepped forward, and Sarah quickly identified their affiliations based on their bearing and appearance: Delta Force, Marine Force Reconnaissance, and what appeared to be CIA Special Activities Division operatives. This was shaping up to be more than a friendly visit. "Our concern," continued a stocky Marine major named Davidson, "is that you're introducing techniques that haven't been properly vetted through established training protocols. Special operations units rely on standardized procedures for unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness." Sarah nodded politely, but her mind was already analyzing the real reason for their visit. These men weren't concerned about training protocols, they were worried about being left behind in some new evolution of special operations capabilities. "I appreciate your concerns," she replied. "But my training supplements existing protocols rather than replacing them. The fundamentals remain the same." "The fundamentals?" Parker laughed harshly. "Lieutenant, we've seen footage of your demonstrations. What you're doing bears no resemblance to standard military combatives." That revelation stopped Sarah cold. Footage meant surveillance, either official or unofficial. Someone had been recording her training sessions without her knowledge. "May I ask who provided this footage?" she asked carefully. The men exchanged glances, and Sarah caught the subtle communication that passed between them. They were operating under orders, probably from multiple agencies with competing interests. "That's not important," said the CIA operative, a lean man with cold eyes who had introduced himself only as Smith. "What's important is understanding what you're really doing here and whether it represents a threat to established special operations doctrine." Before Sarah could respond, the gymnasium doors opened and Chief Williams entered with a group of SEAL candidates. The young men stopped short when they saw the cluster of unfamiliar faces surrounding their instructor. "Ma'am," Williams said, his tone carefully neutral, "are we interrupting something?" Sarah realized she was at a critical juncture. How she handled this confrontation would determine not only her future at Coronado but possibly the entire direction of her training program. "Not at all, Chief. These gentlemen were just leaving." Parker's eyebrows rose at her dismissal. "Lieutenant, I don't think you understand the situation. We're here under orders from Colonel," Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Unless you have official business with Naval Special Warfare Command, I suggest you conduct your observations through proper channels." The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. The SEAL candidates sensed the confrontation brewing and moved subtly to flank the visitors, their loyalty to their instructor clear despite having known her for only a few weeks. Smith, the CIA operative, stepped forward with a predatory smile. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private, Lieutenant." Away from the candidates. Sarah recognized the implied threat. These men weren't here for a friendly discussion, they were here to shut down her program or bring it under their control. But she also knew that backing down would be interpreted as weakness. "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of my students," she replied firmly. Parker's face darkened. "This is bigger than your little training program, Mitchell. What you're doing here has implications for the entire special operations community." "And what exactly am I doing, Colonel?" Sarah asked, stepping closer to the group of visitors. Teaching combat techniques that work? Preparing these men for real-world threats? You're teaching them to think outside established doctrine, Davidson, the Marine major, accused. That kind of individualistic approach undermines unit cohesion and command structure. Candidate Stevens, the former football player who had been Sarah's first demonstration partner, couldn't contain himself any longer. Sir, with respect, the techniques Lieutenant Mitchell has taught us could save our lives in the field. Parker turned his attention to Stevens, his expression calculating. Is that so? And what makes you think these techniques are superior to proven special operations methods? Stevens looked to Sarah for permission to speak freely. When she nodded, he continued. Sir, we've been learning how to adapt to situations that don't fit standard tactical scenarios. Urban environments, improvised weapons, dealing with enemies who don't follow conventional warfare rules. Exactly our point, Smith interjected. You're being trained to operate outside established parameters. That makes you unpredictable elements in joint operations. Chief Williams stepped forward, his years of experience lending authority to his words. Gentlemen, I've been training SEALs for over a decade. What Lieutenant Mitchell is teaching doesn't replace our standard training, it enhances it. These candidates are learning to think tactically while maintaining their fundamental skills. The confrontation might have escalated further, but the gymnasium doors opened again to admit Captain Harrison and Admiral Peterson. Both men looked grim as they surveyed the scene. Gentlemen, Peterson said, his voice carrying unmistakable authority, I believe you're in my facility without proper authorization. Parker straightened, recognizing the need to show proper military courtesy despite the circumstances. Admiral, we're here under Joint Task Force orders to evaluate potential security concerns related to Lieutenant Mitchell's training program. Peterson's expression didn't change. And, do you have documentation for these orders? The visitors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Smith produced a letter from his jacket, which Peterson examined carefully. Sarah watched the Admiral's face as he read, noting the tightening around his eyes that suggested displeasure. This authorization, Peterson said finally, grants you permission to observe training exercises, not to interfere with ongoing operations. Lieutenant Mitchell's program continues under my command. Parker's jaw tightened. Admiral, with respect, this isn't just a Navy issue anymore. What's happening here has implications for all special operations units. Then, perhaps those units should focus on improving their own training instead of trying to shut down innovation, Peterson replied coolly. The exchange that followed was tense but civil, with Peterson making it clear that his facility would operate under Navy command regardless of outside pressure. The visitors eventually left, but Sarah knew this was far from over. After they departed, Admiral Peterson turned to Sarah with a concerned expression. Lieutenant, what exactly have you been teaching that has everyone so worried? Sarah looked around at the candidates and instructors watching the conversation. These men deserved to know what they were caught up in, even if the full truth remained classified. Admiral, I've been teaching adaptive combat techniques that prepare our people for non-standard threats. Urban warfare, psychological operations, improvised weapon systems, and, most importantly, how to think tactically when standard procedures don't apply. Peterson nodded slowly. And, this threatens other units how? Because, Sarah said carefully, it suggests that traditional special operations training might not be adequate for current and future threats. If SEALs start performing significantly better in joint operations, it raises questions about everyone else's methods. The implications hung heavy in the air. The special operations community was highly competitive, with each unit jealously guarding its reputation and capabilities. If Sarah's training produced demonstrably superior results, it could trigger a complete re-evaluation of how America's elite warriors were prepared for combat. Sir, Candidate Patterson spoke up, are we going to be able to continue with this training? Peterson looked at the young man with something approaching paternal concern. That depends on several factors beyond our control, son. But, as long as I'm in command here, you'll get the best training we can provide. Over the following days, Sarah noticed increased surveillance around the facility. Unmarked vehicles appeared at various observation points, and she began receiving reports from her contacts in the intelligence community about inquiries into her background and current assignment. The pressure was building from multiple directions, but Sarah was determined to complete her mission. During an evening training session focused on urban combat scenarios, she decided to address the situation directly with her candidates. Some of you may be wondering about the recent visitors, she began as the group gathered around her. I want you to understand what's really at stake here. The candidates listened intently as Sarah explained, in carefully chosen words, how their training represented a potential shift in special operations doctrine. She couldn't reveal the classified aspects of her background, but she could help them understand why their preparation was attracting so much attention. The techniques you're learning aren't experimental, she assured them. They've been tested in real-world situations. But they challenged some assumptions about how special operations forces should be trained and deployed. Stevens raised his hand. Ma'am, are you saying that other units don't want us to have these capabilities? Sarah chose her words carefully. I'm saying that change is always difficult, especially in military organizations that have been successful with existing methods. But warfare is evolving, and our training must evolve with it. Chief Williams added his perspective. What the lieutenant is teaching you represents the cutting edge of special operations training. Some people always resist new approaches, even when they're clearly superior. As the evening session continued, Sarah put the candidates through increasingly complex scenarios designed to test their ability to adapt and improvise. She watched with satisfaction as they applied the principles she had taught them, combining technical skills with tactical thinking in ways that went beyond standard military training. But, even as she felt pride in their progress, Sarah knew that political forces beyond their control were shaping the future of the program. Phone calls were being made in Washington, meetings were being held in classified facilities, and decisions were being made that would determine whether her approach to training would be allowed to continue. That night, as Sarah reviewed training reports in her quarters, she received a secure phone call from a familiar voice. Sarah, it's Marcus, said the voice of her former handler from the intelligence community. We need to talk. Marcus Reed had been Sarah's control officer during some of her most dangerous assignments. If he was calling directly, it meant the situation had escalated to levels that threatened her current mission. What's the status? She asked, automatically falling back into the communication patterns of her intelligence work. Multiple agencies are pushing for your reassignment, Marcus said bluntly. They want you back in the field, away from Coronado and away from training programs that are making people nervous. Sarah felt a familiar cold sensation in her stomach. And our position? Officially, we support your current assignment. Unofficially, there are discussions about whether your unique skills might be better utilized in other capacities. The message was clear. Her protectors in the intelligence community were under pressure, and their support might not be sufficient to keep her at Coronado much longer. How much time do I have? She asked. Unknown. But I'd suggest making your training program as successful as possible, as quickly as possible. Results speak louder than politics. After the call ended, Sarah sat in her quarters contemplating her options. She could accept reassignment and return to the shadowy world of intelligence operations, abandoning the SEAL candidates who had come to depend on her training. Or she could fight to stay, potentially damaging her career and alienating powerful people who had supported her in the past. As she weighed her choices, Sarah thought about the young men she had been training. They were preparing to risk their lives for their country, and they deserved every advantage she could give them. The political games being played in Washington were less important than ensuring these warriors had the skills they needed to survive and succeed in an increasingly dangerous world. The decision crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity. She would stay and fight for her program, whatever the consequences. The SEAL candidates had cornered her, in a sense, with their trust and dedication. She couldn't abandon them now, any more than she could have abandoned her teammates during classified operations. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began drafting a comprehensive report on her training methods and their effectiveness. If she was going to fight for her program, she needed documentation that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. The real battle was just beginning, and she intended to win it. 6 weeks into her assignment, Sarah faced the ultimate test of her training methods and her ability to protect the program she had built. The challenge came in the form of an unscheduled evaluation exercise that would determine not only the future of her training curriculum but potentially reshape how America's elite warriors were prepared for combat. The morning began with an emergency briefing called by Admiral Peterson. Sarah arrived at the conference room to find it filled with high-ranking officers from multiple branches of the military, intelligence agency representatives, and several faces she recognized from the Pentagon. At the head of the table sat General Patricia Morrison, the first woman to command Joint Special Operations Command, whose reputation for no-nonsense leadership was legendary throughout the special operations community. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Peterson announced, "General Morrison is here to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of our training programs, with particular attention to Lieutenant Mitchell's innovative methods." General Morrison stood, her bearing radiating the authority that came from decades of leading America's most dangerous missions. "I'm going to be direct about why I'm here. This facility has become the center of a controversy that's reached the highest levels of the Pentagon. Some people think Lieutenant Mitchell represents the future of special operations training. Others believe she's a security risk who's undermining established doctrine." The general's eyes found Sarah across the room. "So we're going to settle this definitively. Lieutenant Mitchell's candidates will participate in a live-fire exercise against opposition forces composed of instructors from Delta Force, Marine Force Reconnaissance, and Navy SEAL Team 6. The scenario will simulate a high-value target rescue mission in urban terrain." Sarah felt her stomach drop. This wasn't an evaluation, it was a setup designed to discredit her methods. The opposition force would consist of the most experienced special operations personnel in the American military, men with decades of combat experience facing candidates who had been training for only a few months. Admiral Peterson interjected, "With respect, that scenario seems heavily weighted against the candidates. They're not even halfway through their training program." Morrison's smile was sharp. "Admiral, if Lieutenant Mitchell's methods are as revolutionary as some claim, her candidates should be able to perform at levels that exceed conventional expectations. If not, we'll have our answer about the value of her approach." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Sarah's candidates would be facing a nearly impossible challenge, and failure would be used to justify shutting down her program and possibly ending her military career. "When does this exercise take place?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Tomorrow morning," Morrison replied. 12 hours from now. Your candidates will receive their briefing at 0600, and the exercise begins at 0800. As the meeting broke up, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Everything she had worked for, everything she believed about preparing warriors for modern warfare, would be tested in 12 hours. Worse, the futures of 23 young men who had trusted her training would be decided by an exercise designed to demonstrate their inadequacy. Chief Williams approached her as she gathered her materials. "Ma'am, this isn't fair. Those opposition forces have a combined total of over 200 years of combat experience." "No, it's not fair," Sarah agreed. "But fairness isn't the point. They want to prove that unconventional training methods can't compete with established special operations capabilities. So what do we do?" Williams asked. Sarah looked around the room at the departing officials, noting the satisfied expressions on several faces. They thought they had outmaneuvered her, created a situation where her candidates would fail spectacularly and publicly. "We prepare our men for the fight of their lives," she said quietly. "And we show them what they're really capable of." That evening, Sarah called her candidates together for an emergency training session. The young men gathered in the gymnasium with the serious expressions of warriors who sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Tomorrow morning you'll face the most challenging exercise of your military careers," Sarah began without preamble. "You'll be going up against some of the most experienced special operations personnel in the world, in a scenario designed to test everything you've learned." Candidate Patterson raised his hand. "Ma'am, are you saying this is some kind of test of your training methods?" Sarah nodded. "That's exactly what I'm saying.
There are people who believe that the techniques I've taught you are inferior to conventional special operations training. Tomorrow, you'll have the chance to prove them wrong.
The candidates exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the mixture of excitement and apprehension on their faces. They were young, eager, and confident in their abilities, but they also understood the magnitude of what they were facing.
Stevens spoke up. "What's the scenario, ma'am?"
"Urban hostage rescue," Sarah replied.
"High-value target extraction from a fortified position defended by experienced opposition forces. You'll be outnumbered and outgunned, facing enemies who know every tactical doctrine in the book."
"So how do we win?" asked candidate Rodriguez, a quiet young man from New Mexico who had consistently excelled in Sarah's unconventional training exercises.
Sarah smiled for the first time that day.
"By remembering everything you've learned about adaptive thinking and unconventional approaches. Your opponents expect you to follow standard assault protocols. Instead, you're going to do something they won't anticipate." Over the next 4 hours, Sarah put her candidates through the most intensive preparation session of their training. She focused on the principles that distinguished her methods from conventional military training: psychological warfare, improvised tactics, and, most importantly, the ability to think beyond established doctrine.
"The opposition force will be positioned according to textbook defensive strategies," she explained as they studied the exercise terrain on satellite photographs.
"They'll expect frontal assaults, coordinated team movements, and standard breaching techniques."
"So we do the opposite?" Patterson asked. "Not the opposite," Sarah corrected. "Something entirely different.
Something they won't have trained for because it's not in any manual."
As midnight approached, Sarah gathered her candidates for a final briefing.
These young men had evolved dramatically over the past 6 weeks, transforming from conventional military trainees into something new and, potentially revolutionary.
"I want you to understand something," she said, looking around at their faces. "Tomorrow isn't just about completing an exercise.
It's about proving that adaptive thinking and unconventional approaches can succeed where traditional methods fail." Candidate Martinez, a former gang member from Los Angeles who had joined the Navy to escape his past, spoke up.
"Ma'am, what happens if we fail?" Sarah met his eyes directly. "Then, we fail honestly, using everything we've learned. But I don't think that's going to happen. You're not the same men who walked into this facility 6 weeks ago."
The next morning arrived with fog rolling in from the Pacific, creating perfect conditions for the type of unconventional assault Sarah had planned. As her candidates prepared their gear, she watched them with a mixture of pride and concern. They moved with confidence and purpose, but they were still facing overwhelming odds. General Morrison arrived with an entourage of observers that included representatives from every major military and intelligence agency. The exercise area had been set up in an abandoned section of the base, with buildings modified to simulate an urban combat environment.
"The opposition force consists of 12 experienced special operations personnel," Morrison announced to the assembled observers.
"The candidate's mission is to extract a high-value target from the central building and escort him to a designated extraction point." Sarah noticed that the opposition force included several men she recognized from her intelligence community background, operators whose reputations were legendary within classified circles. They weren't just experienced, they were among the most skilled warriors America had ever produced. As the exercise began, Sarah watched from the observation post with growing tension.
Her candidates had disappeared into the urban terrain using an approach she had taught them that didn't appear in any military manual.
Instead of advancing as a unit toward the target building, they had dispersed into the environment like ghosts. The opposition force had positioned itself according to standard defensive doctrine, creating overlapping fields of fire and establishing strong points that could repel conventional assaults. They were confident in their positions, experienced in their tactics, and completely unprepared for what Sarah's candidates were about to do. The first indication that something unexpected was happening came when opposition force communications began reporting strange sounds and movements that didn't fit any recognizable assault pattern.
The experienced defenders found themselves dealing with psychological pressure techniques that weren't part of standard military training. "What are your candidates doing?" General Morrison asked, studying the tactical displays that showed confusing movement patterns from the attacking force.
They're adapting to the situation, Sarah replied neutrally, though inside she felt a growing sense of excitement as her training methods played out in real time. The breakthrough came when candidate Rodriguez appeared in the target building through a route that the opposition force hadn't anticipated or defended. While the defenders focused on the obvious approach routes, he had used urban terrain features to approach from an angle that wasn't covered by standard defensive protocols.
Within minutes, the entire dynamic of the exercise shifted. Sarah's candidates began appearing in positions that shouldn't have been accessible, using techniques that the opposition force hadn't trained to counter. They moved like predators rather than soldiers, employing psychological warfare alongside physical tactics. The high-value target was extracted not through overwhelming firepower or superior numbers, but through a coordinated effort that combined deception, improvised tactics, and adaptive thinking. The opposition force, despite their experience and its skill, found themselves outmaneuvered by candidates who refused to follow conventional assault doctrine. When the exercise concluded, the silence in the observation post was deafening. General Morrison stared at the tactical display showing the successful extraction, her expression unreadable. The opposition force commander, a Delta Force colonel with over 20 years of special operations experience, looked genuinely bewildered. "How did they do that?" he asked, approaching Sarah with a mixture of respect and confusion. "We anticipated every standard assault approach, but they came at us with techniques I've never encountered." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Colonel, they did exactly what I trained them to do: think beyond conventional approaches and adapt to the tactical situation." General Morrison called for a debrief session that lasted 3 hours. The candidates explained their approach, detailing how they had used psychological warfare, unconventional movement techniques, and improvised tactics to overcome a superior force positioned in strong defensive terrain. As the debrief concluded, Morrison turned to Sarah with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. "Lieutenant, I came here expecting to shut down your program as a dangerous deviation from proven methods." "And now, General?" Sarah asked. "Now I'm wondering why we're not implementing your techniques across all special operations units."
Morrison paused, studying the faces of the candidates who had just achieved the impossible. "What you've accomplished here represents a fundamental evolution in how we prepare our warriors." The political implications were immediate and far-reaching. Within hours of the exercise's conclusion, Sarah received calls from Pentagon officials, intelligence agency directors, and special operations commanders from around the world. Her training methods had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, and everyone wanted to understand how to implement them. But, for Sarah, the most important validation came from her candidates. As they cleaned their gear and prepared for the rest of their training, she saw something in their faces that hadn't been there 6 weeks earlier: the absolute confidence that came from knowing they could adapt and succeed in any situation. Chief Williams approached her as the afternoon sun began to set over the Pacific. "Ma'am, I've been training SEALs for over a decade, but I've never seen anything like what happened today." Sarah looked around at her candidates, these young men who had started as conventional military trainees and evolved into something entirely new. "Chief, they didn't win because they were better soldiers. They won because they learned to think like warriors." The revolution in special operations training had begun not with policy changes or new equipment, but with a woman who had been dismissed as a rookie instructor teaching young warriors that the most powerful weapon they possessed was their ability to adapt and think beyond conventional limitations. 3 months later, Sarah's training methods had been adopted by special operations units across all branches of the military. Her candidates graduated as the highest-scoring SEAL class in the program's history, going on to successful careers that validated everything she had taught them. The woman they had tried to corner as a rookie had not only survived the challenge but had fundamentally changed how America prepared its most elite warriors. And, in classified facilities around the world, other nations scrambled to understand and counter the new breed of special operations forces that Sarah Mitchell had helped create. The real victory wasn't in the exercise that had vindicated her methods, but in the knowledge that future warriors would be better prepared for the challenges they would face. Sarah had taken everything she had learned in the shadows and brought it into the light, ensuring that the hard-won lessons of her classified career would live on in the men and women who followed in her footsteps.